Good evening. This is without doubt the most striking location I have ever given a speech in. It's quite astonishing. I can't actually see you all, but I imagine you're there. But I know that you can see me. And I'm very excited and honoured to be giving you this talk this evening. In 1634, the English lawyer and author William Prynne was sentenced to life imprisonment, fined £5,000, which is more than £1 million in today's money, and I know that because I asked Twitter, and had both his ears cut off. His crime was the publication of Histriomastics, a 1,000-page puritanical tome dedicated to showing that plays were unlawful and incentives to immorality. He didn't have many good things to say about women either, so plus ça change for some cultural commentators. It's a dreadful irony that this work, which in effect advocates censorship, resulted in some of the most gruesome punishments you can inflict on an author for their writing. Nor did his punishment end there. Accused of publishing seditious libels again in 1637, Prynne had the letter SL branded on both his cheeks. I mention the example of Prynne because it is the first cited in an exhibition of book covers currently on display at Pembroke College, Cambridge University, where this week my organisation, Index on Censorship, kicked off a series of talks and discussions for Banned Books Week, of which this lecture is the final event. And I mention it because it reminds us, while it reminds us of how far we in the UK and in Ireland have come in the past 350 years or so, the exhibition was actually also a powerful reminder of the fact that censorship is still alive and well, albeit in different forms, in our democracies today. So the exhibition ran along two sides of the library. On one side were the cases from the 1630s to 1800s. The entire other side of the exhibition reflected instances of censorship in the UK just in the past 100 years. So if you imagine you on the left-hand side there, that's 1600s to 1800s, and this side is just the past 100 years. Examples included in 1946 the burning of copies of insipid love story Forever Amber, not by the state, but by public libraries no less. I want you to stop to think about that for a moment. In 1946, barely a decade after perhaps some of the most infamous book burnings in history, those of Nazi Germany, public libraries in the United Kingdom thought it fit and proper to burn a historical romance that one judge in the States described rather damningly as soporific rather than aphrodisiac. I haven't read it, by the way. That was 1946, so a bygone era perhaps? Sadly not. 64 years later in 2000, a New York-based Limerick man took out an $800 half-page advertisement in Irish-American newspaper The Irish Echo, inviting people to bring copies of Angela Ashes to a book-burning ceremony to protest the way this city was treated in the novel and the film of the same name. The Angela's Ashes incident shows us that the urge to censor, to limit the publication or promotion of ideas we find offensive, whether on grounds of obscenity, of religion or politics, remains strong. So my talk this evening is going to examine the new sources of censorship, not just in the context of literature, and posit some ways we can resist the urge to silence others. But first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and why I care about these issues and about the organisation I run. As David said, I'm a journalist, and I've wanted to be a journalist for as long as I can remember. As a child, I was dreadful. I would make my friends play the news, which we then performed to our long-suffering parents, and I dreamed of being BBC foreign correspondent Kate Adie. When I finally got to cover an actual war, civil conflict in Ivory Coast, I discovered actually that it was pretty terrifying, and I did not, after all, want to become a war correspondent, and ended up instead as London bureau chief for Reuters news agency, whereupon I found myself in charge of coverage for the UK riots of 2011. I became a journalist because I wanted to tell stories that were not being heard. I love literature because I believe in the power of the written word to convey and transport us to a world beyond our own imagining, and that my own world is enriched as a result. So it seemed a very natural fit when I was asked if I was interested in running Index on Censorship, one of the world's leading organisations in the defence of free expression. Index on Censorship was founded 45 years ago by the poet Stephen Spender in response to what seemed like a simple request. What could the artists and intellectuals of the West do to support their counterparts behind the Iron Curtain and those under the thumb of oppressive regimes elsewhere? Organisations like Amnesty and PEN already existed, doing then, as now, a formidable job of petitioning and campaigning, particularly on cases of the imprisoned. What more could be done? The answer, those who established Index decided, was to publish the works of these censored writers and artists and stories about them. Index on Censorship magazine was born, and we have continued to produce the magazine, this magazine, on at least a quarterly basis ever since. Writers for the magazine have included the likes of Arthur Miller, Nadine Gordimer, Hilary Mantel, Václav Havel, and Samuel Beckett. One of the T-shirts featured in the Index on Censorship archive reads, "If Samuel Beckett had been born in Czechoslovakia, we'd still be waiting for Godot." Thank you, I'm glad some of you laughed. It was part of our campaign that Beckett supported to bring attention to the plight of writers in then Czechoslovakia. Beckett's play was banned in the East European country at the same time as the communist government was persecuting its own writers. Beckett became drawn to the case of Czech playwright Havel and committed to bringing world attention to the way writers were being banned. Beckett was so incensed by what was happening to Havel that he wrote the short play Catastrophe, dedicated to Havel, and allowed Index the exclusive to publish it first in its pages. Beckett's action encapsulates the motivation of those who first established Index. This motivation, as Spender wrote in the first edition of the magazine, was to act always with concern for those not free, responding to the appeals from Soviet writers to their Western counterparts. The Russian writers, Spender wrote, seem to take it for granted that in spite of the ideological conditioning of the society in which they live, there is nevertheless an international community of scientists, writers, and scholars thinking about the same problems and applying to them the same human values. These intellectuals regard certain guarantees of freedom as essential if they are to develop their ideas fruitfully. Freedom, for them, consists primarily of conditions which make exchange of ideas and truthfully recorded experiences possible. I will ask in my talk this evening, given the debates about no platforming in universities, the controversy over kneeling for the US flag, the fact that the BBC's political correspondent needs a bodyguard to cover a political conference, whether we currently have the conditions which make exchange of ideas possible. Why is it important to tackle censorship? Sometimes we forget to ask ourselves this question because we take it for granted that freedom is a good thing. Consider all of those who were quick to shout, "Je suis Charlie," following the attacks on French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo. The knee-jerk reaction in Western liberal democracies is often to say you are for free speech without ever really stopping to consider why you might be for it, or why free speech is and of itself a good thing. I would argue this failure to understand the value of free speech lies at the heart of one of the dilemmas we face in modern democracies, where free speech is gradually being eroded, where "Je suis Charlie" quickly became "Je suis Charlie, but." It's vital to understand the value inherent in free expression, to understand why some of the current tensions surrounding free speech exist. It's also crucial for understanding the ways to tackle the dangerous trade-offs that are increasingly being made, in which free expression is seen as a right that must be pitted and lose against safety, security, and privacy. Many people have written eloquently on the benefits of free expression. But I think John Stuart Mill expresses it best when he talks of free expression being fundamental to the permanent interests of man as a progressive being. The particular evil of silencing the expression of an opinion, he argues in On Liberty, is that it is robbing the human race. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. This latter argument is particularly powerful when we consider, for example, the introduction of Holocaust denial laws. Such laws suggest that there are some truths so precious that they have to be protected by law, rather than having their truth reinforced by repeated collision with error. You can imagine authoritarian regimes everywhere looking at such laws and rubbing their hands with glee at the prospect of being able to impose a single view of history on the populace without any kind of challenge. The free exchange of ideas, opinions, and information is in Mill's doctrine a kind of positive cacophony from which clear sounds emerge. In this doctrine, it is not just the having of ideas, but the expressing of them that becomes vital. Which brings us back to the question of whether we have the conditions for the exchange of ideas in 2017 across the world. I want to focus on 4 key areas on which index campaigns for free expression: the arts, academia, media, and online, and look at what I consider to be some of the main sources of censorship, by which I mean attempts to stifle and silence ideas and debate in democratic countries and further afield. So let's begin with the arts. A number of recent cases, I think, highlight the contemporary censorious impulses in democracies. And the first case is the case of Exhibit B, a theatrical installation meant to highlight the horrors of so-called human zoos of the 19th century. Created by white artist Brett Bailey, Exhibit B was described by London's Barbican as a human installation that charts the colonial histories of various European countries during the 19th and 20th centuries, when scientists formulated pseudo-scientific racial theories that continue to warp perceptions with horrific consequences. Exhibit B involved black actors, often chained or in masks, sitting silently while viewers to the installation filed past. In 2014, Exhibit B, which received 5-star reviews elsewhere and was successfully shown just weeks before at the Barbican Festival, was pulled from a planned staging at London's Barbican on the advice of police, following a sustained campaign against the work online and off, including a very vocal protest outside the theatre. Those who objected to the artwork, many of whom had not seen it, described it as racist. Now, I am not objecting to people's right to protest against works or ideas they find offensive. Indeed, the ability to protest is a fundamental tenet of free expression. But what is salient, I think, about Exhibit B is that it demonstrates a growing belief that the opinions of one set of people should be allowed to infringe the legal rights of others to express themselves. Exhibit B was not closed down by police for hate speech or inciting violence. It was closed down because the police and the venue itself did not believe they could protect the audience or actors from any potential spillover from the protests about the work. In this case, one group of self-appointed spokespeople for a community infringed the rights of others to express themselves. Estella Odunlami, an actor who took part in the Barbican's Exhibit B, wrote in The Guardian, "I chose to take part in Exhibit B because I was inspired by the premise of the work. It forces us to examine the darkest corners of our mind. It is brutal, unforgiving, and unapologetic. I decided, as an educated black artist, that it told a story that should be shared with the world, but sadly that will no longer be the case. My freedom of expression was taken the moment the protesters decided to attempt to storm the venue, causing it to be evacuated and deemed unsafe. It was at that moment that the protesters retained their right to free speech, and I had mine taken away." More recently, we've had more explicit threats of violence, for example, over the Guggenheim's exhibition on China, which featured Films and artwork which featured animals and animal rights activists threatened violence against the Guggenheim, and the Guggenheim was forced to pull that part of the exhibition. Offence and hurt are in the eye of the beholder. Once we let a mob decide what can and cannot be expressed, we are in dangerous territory indeed. We see this mob mentality most often reflected in the hysteria that whips up at speed when an individual or group of individuals takes offence on social media about something, and how that fireball of fury can intimidate artists and others to self-censor as a result. Irish author Claire Hennessy, who was actually also in Limerick today, spoke eloquently about this at an event hosted in London last night, and the kinds of threats she's faced include not just a Twitter mob becoming incensed about her work online, but actually people going so far as to find out where she works and ring up her organisations to encourage her employers to sack her because they were so offended by some of the works that she produced. Such campaigns do not just force self-censorship, they can prevent works from getting an audience at all. Consider a young adult novel called The Black Witch, about a girl named Ellerin, who's been raised in a stratified society where other races, Selkies, Fae, Wolfmen, are considered inferior at best and enemies at worst, and who, when she goes off to college, begins to question her beliefs. The book was subjected to a sustained campaign of online abuse ahead of publication after one blogger who had read the book wrote that the fantasy novel was the most dangerous, offensive book I have ever read. This is a fantasy novel about Selkies, Fae and Wolfmen, the most dangerous, offensive book I've ever read. As a result of this sustained online campaign, the book's Goodreads rating, which is an important way of assessing whether you might want to read a book or not, it's a bit like TripAdvisor for books, its Goodreads rating dropped an abysmal 1.7 thanks to a mass coordinated campaign of one-star reviews, mostly from people who admitted not having read the book. I have to say I haven't read it either, but I haven't rated it. Nervousness about offence is not restricted to concerns, however, about the reaction it might generate in the online world. Salman Rushdie, for example, has said he does not think the satanic verses would be published today. And in the wake of the killing of those associated with Charlie Hebdo, the killings at the Bataclan nightclub in Paris, the shooting at a free speech event in Copenhagen, it's not difficult to see why. This mob as censor dynamic is something we shall see rearing its head again when we come to talk about media and academia, and is one of the pincer movements I identify as being at the heart of modern censorship in democracies. The second pincer movement is led primarily by governments and relates to a privileging of national security over almost all other values in modern societies. The crackdowns justified in the name of national security are widespread and increasingly misused. Take, for example, the situation in Turkey. It's not just journalists who face the ire of President Erdogan as he seeks to weed out his enemies. Artists face his wrath too. Cartoonist, it's a new word I've just invented. Cartoonist Musa Kart, for example, has been in detention for the past 10 months and faces 29 years in jail for his cartoon satirizing the government. Jailing is one effective way to silence your enemies. Another is preventing them from travel. In Malaysia, another cartoonist, Zunar, is currently subject to a travel ban and faces 43 years in jail for his work satirizing the Prime Minister and his wife. 43 years. That's almost the length that Index on Censorship has been operating. In these so-called democracies, those in power behave increasingly like despots. And one thing you notice that's quite common among despots is they hate more than anything being laughed at. And if you don't believe me, consider the fact that President Erdogan tried to have the German government prosecute a German comedian for reciting, on German television, a poem that lampooned him. Even worse, Chancellor Angela Merkel paved the way for the possible prosecution of Jan Böhmermann by leaving it up to prosecutors to decide whether to take the case forward. If free speech cannot be defended by Germany within its own borders, what hope is there for its global defence? And I really want to say something here about the importance of a robust defense of fundamental universal rights and freedoms within democracies as standard bearers for these rights globally. Autocratic and repressive regimes look to justify their own behaviour by pointing to comparable behaviour by that of democracies. And that's why I would welcome the fact that Ireland's blasphemy law will be considered in the upcoming referendum. Ireland is the only country in the developed Western world to have introduced a blasphemy law in the 21st century. And that, I'm afraid, has given succor to those countries who wield their own blasphemy laws to heavily punish blasphemers. For instance, the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation, which has 57 member states, cites Ireland's law as best practice and has even proposed adopting its precise wording to limit human rights on freedom of conscience. Laws, blasphemy laws like that, still on the statute in Ireland, give strength to the likes of Pakistan, where a woman, Asia Bibi, is currently in jail awaiting execution simply for having drunk the same water as her Christian neighbours, as her Muslim neighbours. Freedom to express one's religious beliefs are a key barometer of free expression in a country. Another important indicator by which free expression can be measured is the state of its media. And on this measure, the picture, I'm afraid, is also far from rosy. It might get jollier later. Index has been running a project in 2014 on threats to media freedom in Europe and neighbouring countries. The picture that the Mapping Media Freedom Project paints is alarming, and I say that as a journalist. Journalists in our region have been killed, arrested, and systematically harassed for doing their jobs. And this harassment isn't only taking place in countries where you might expect it, like Turkey, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, but much closer to home. Only this week, as I mentioned before, we learned that the BBC's political correspondent, Laura Kuenssberg, has been assigned a bodyguard because of threats against her. Again, think about that for a moment. One of the most senior journalists at Britain's public broadcaster requires a security detail to cover the conference of the country's leading opposition party. Online harassment, intimidation by the state, and legal measures are all ways in which attempts to silence the media are made. In some countries, the stakes for journalists are impossibly high. In Mexico, more than 8 journalists have been killed this year alone as the cartels, vigilante groups, and security forces in that country wrestle for power. Few of these killings, if any, are ever solved, encouraging an atmosphere of impunity. In Turkey, hundreds of journalists are in jail. And at the far end of the spectrum, countries like Eritrea have no independent media whatsoever. In between are countries like Ireland, which a report in 2016 by human rights lawyers Doughty Street Chambers found had one of the most concentrated media markets of any democracy. The report said accumulation of what had been described as communicative power within the news market was at endemic levels, and this, combined with the dominance of one individual media owner in the state, created conditions in which wealthy individuals and organizations can amass huge political and economic power and distort the media landscape to suit their interests and personal views. I'm very much hoping that this speech gets reported in those media. You might want to ask yourself why. In discrediting, and on top of all that, in discrediting and dismissing all journalism he doesn't like as fake news, the President of the United States creates an environment in which attacks on journalists feel like fair game everywhere. The President's preferred communications milieu, of course, is social media. And the internet is currently the battleground for some of the most important debates on free speech in the 21st century. On the one hand, the internet offers an incredible tool for democratizing speech, a relatively cheap platform that allows anyone with access the means to make their voice heard. However, it also provides a tool for the nasty, cruel, and often just frankly bored to harass and bully others into silence. That is a challenge that we, as free speech advocates, would be wrong to ignore, but for which censorship is the wrong answer. Nor is the answer effectively abolishing privacy on the internet. This is the particularly pervasive argument used in Western liberal democracies to justify surveillance in the name of national security. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, the mantra goes. In liberal democracies, we're not interested in your ideas, we're just out to get the bad guys committing crimes. It shouldn't stop you expressing yourself, except that it does. Knowledge of mass surveillance by governments is already changing the way in which writers work. A report from PEN American Centre Global Chilling shows an astonishing 1/3 of writers, 34%, living in countries deemed free, have avoided writing or speaking on a particular topic or have seriously considered it due to fear of government surveillance. Some 42% of writers in free countries have curtailed or avoided activities on social media or seriously considered it due to fear of government surveillance, the survey found. In countries that are not free, the consequence of a lack of privacy is acute. Colleagues in Azerbaijan, for example, note that authorities are very quick to demonstrate the country's openness by arguing that they have a lack of curbs on social media. They don't need a curb. As soon as you express yourself openly, the crackdown begins. But it is not just in countries like Azerbaijan that we have to worry about surveillance or the misuse of national security laws. In 2014, British police used legislation introduced explicitly to tackle terrorism to obtain the phone records of the Sun newspaper's Tom Newton Dunn for an investigation into whether one of its officers had leaked information about a political scandal, an action that seriously compromises the basic tenet of a free and independent media, in other words, the confidentiality of sources. Even the hardware being used to quash free expression in authoritarian regimes often comes from supposed democracies. Journalist Iona Craig, a regular reporter from Yemen, describes the phone tapping and other surveillance methods using hardware and software bought from the West that put her and her sources at risk. She and her colleagues now resort to traditional methods of reporting, meeting contacts in person, using pen and paper, to evade surveillance. Privacy, then, is for me the natural corollary of free expression. It allows reporters to protect their sources in pursuit of truth, and advocacy organisations like mine to protect those whom governments seek to silence. But privacy rights should not trump freedom of expression in such a way that they prevent us coming closer to the truth. It's for that reason that Index on Censorship opposed the so-called right to be forgotten ruling that allows private individuals the ability to remove links to information they considered about themselves to be irrelevant or outmoded. Now, in theory, of course, this sounds appealing. Which one of us would not want to massage the way in which we are represented to the outside world? Certainly anyone who has had malicious smears spread about them in false articles or embarrassing pictures posted of their teenage exploits, or even criminals whose convictions are spent and have the legal right to rehabilitation. In practice, though, the ruling is far too blunt, too broad brush, and gives far too much power to search engines. This handing of responsibility to internet companies to police and censor content generally is something we need to be far more alive to. Increasingly, the protection of the individual, using notions of harm defined by the individual themselves, as is the case with right to be forgotten, is used as an argument for censorship. And what I want to do with the remainder of my talk is to discuss ways in which this drive to shield from potential and perceived harm is having an impact. And I want to focus particularly on the world of academia. It's clear that something is going wrong at universities. Institutions that should be crucibles for new thinking, at the forefront of challenges to established thought and practice, are effectively and actively shutting down debate and shying away from an intellectual confrontation. Driven by the notion that students should not be exposed to ideas they find or might find offensive or troubling, student groups and authorities are increasingly squeezing out free speech by banning controversial speakers, denying individuals or groups platforms to speak, and eliminating the possibility of accidental exposure to new ideas through devices such as trigger warnings. In recent years, a number of invited speakers have withdrawn from university engagements or had their invitations rescinded following protests from students and faculty members. Former US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice withdrew from a planned address at Rutgers University in New Jersey after opposition from those who cited her involvement in the Iraq War and the Bush administration's torture of terrorism suspects. Brandeis University in Massachusetts cancelled plans towards an honorary degree to Islam critic Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and Christine Lagarde backed out of a speech at Smith College following objections by students over the acts of the International Monetary Fund, which Lagarde runs. In the UK, the University of East London banned an Islamic preacher for his views on homosexuality. As I said earlier, registering your objection to something or someone is one thing. And indeed, the ability to do that, I say again, is fundamental to free expression. However, actively seeking to prevent that person from speaking or being heard is quite another. And as I alluded to earlier, it's a trend increasingly visible in social media, and its appearance on campus within universities is, to my mind, deeply troubling. It's seen not just in the way that invited speakers are treated, but it stretches far wider. It stretches to the academic fraternity itself. In recent years, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the US withdrew a job offer to academic Stephen Silater following critical posts he made on Twitter about Israel. In an open letter, Phyllis Wise, the university's chancellor, wrote, "A preeminent university must always be a home for difficult discussions and for the teaching of diverse ideas. What we cannot and will not tolerate at the University of Illinois are personal and disrespectful words or actions that demean and abuse either viewpoints themselves or those who express them. We have a particular duty to our students to ensure that they live in a community of scholarship that challenges their assumptions about the world, but that also respects the rights of individuals." These incidents matter because, as education lecturer Joanna Williams wrote in the Telegraph newspaper, if academic freedom is to be in any way meaningful, it must be about far more than the liberty to be surrounded by an inoffensive and bland consensus. Suppressing rather than confronting controversial arguments prevents criticality and the advance of knowledge, surely the antithesis of what a university should be about. Yet increasingly, universities seem to want to shut down controversy, sheltering behind the dangerous notion that protecting people from anything but the blandest and least contentious ideas is a means to keep them safe, rather than encouraging students to have a wide base of knowledge. In the US, some universities are considering advising students that they don't have to read materials that they may find upsetting. And if they don't, their course mark would not suffer. The introduction of trigger warnings at a number of universities is a serious cause for concern. In the UK, increasing intolerance for free expression is manifest in the No Platform movement, which no longer targets speakers or groups that incite violence against others, but a whole host of individuals and organisations that other groups simply find distasteful or in some way disqualified from speaking on other grounds. The decision to cancel an abortion debate, for example, at Oxford in late 2014, which would have been held by two men, also two noted free speech advocates, came after a slew of objections, including a statement from the Students' Union that decried the organisers for having the temerity to invite people who did not have uteruses to discuss the issue. More recently, a human rights campaigner was barred from speaking at Warwick University, a decision that was subsequently overturned, after organisers were told she was highly inflammatory and could incite hatred. And a feminist was barred from speaking at the University of Manchester because her presence was deemed to violate the student union's safe space policy. Encountering views that make us feel uncomfortable, that challenge our worldview, are fundamental to a free society. Universities are places where that encounter should be encouraged and celebrated. They should not be places where ideas are wrapped in cotton wool, where academic freedom comes to mean having a certain single kind of approved thinking, or where only certain approved individuals are allowed to speak on a given topic. Index on Censorship knows well the importance of the scholar in freedom of expression. Though we have come to be known as Index, the charity itself is officially called the Writers and Scholars Educational Trust. You can see why we went with Index. But Writers and Scholars Educational Trust was an effort to capture as simply as possible the individuals that we attempted and intended to support from the outset. The title was never intended to be exclusive, but the inclusion of scholar signals the importance our founders attached to the role of the academic as a defender and promoter of free speech. In 2017, as we watch the spaces for free expression narrow, I hope that together we can work doubly hard that traditional bastions for free speech, and indeed institutions that were not always its greatest advocates, including the institution in which we stand, that they remain arena for the clash of ideas and not the closure of minds. Thank you for listening.